The news hit like a thunderclap. No one saw it coming. Just moments ago, the world believed the Carrington family, a Hollywood dynasty known for glittering premieres, philanthropic galas, and an image of perfection, was untouchable. But that illusion shattered in an instant. What happened inside the Carrington estate on that fateful Sunday would rock the industry, the media, and the people who thought they knew them best. And today, for the first time, someone from inside the family is breaking their silence, revealing secrets that have been buried for decades. Secrets so dark, so shocking, that the very foundations of trust, loyalty, and love are being questioned. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Have you ever wondered what goes on behind the gilded gates of the rich and famous? The truth is rarely clean. The Carringtons were no exception. On the surface, they embodied success. Richard Carrington, 78, the legendary filmmaker whose movies defined generations, and his wife, Marlene, 70, a socialite and art patron who seemed to glide effortlessly through life. Their home was a palace tucked away in Brentwood, surrounded by manicured lawns, security cameras, and neighbors who whispered about the family's charm and grace. But behind those walls, tension festered like an unseen storm. It began with whispers in the industry, barely audible at first, easily dismissed as rumor. The Carringtons are tense with their eldest son, Jason. People would murmur at premieres. It's nothing, just family dynamics. But as the years went by, those whispers grew into something heavier, darker. Insiders hinted at arguments, unusual behavior, even threats, though nothing concrete ever emerged. Until that day, the morning of the incident seemed ordinary. Richard had his usual routine. A cup of black coffee, a walk through the gardens, and a call with his longtime friend and colleague, Martin Keller. Marlene was preparing for an art exhibit in Los Angeles, chatting with her assistant about the final arrangements. Jason, their 32-year-old son, had been staying in the guest house on the estate, seemingly detached from his parents' lives. No one anticipated what was about to happen. By early afternoon, a neighbor across the street noticed something strange. The Carrington gates, usually pristine and secure, were wide open. That was unusual, unsettling, even. Moments later, an emergency call pierced the quiet. The bodies of Richard and Marlene Carrington had been discovered inside their own home, victims of multiple sharp force injuries. Authorities confirmed it within hours. The news spread like wildfire. Social media exploded. Journalists camped outside the estate, and millions across the country couldn't comprehend the horror. How could such violence occur in one of the wealthiest, most guarded homes in Los Angeles? But what made the story even more unbelievable was the alleged suspect, Jason, their only son, the same person who had been living under their roof. Within hours, authorities had taken him into custody. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The shock wasn't just in the brutality of the crime, it was in the betrayal. The thought that a son could turn on his parents, that a family celebrated in tabloids for its glamour and closeness could harbor such darkness, stunned everyone. What exactly led to this unimaginable act? What were the signs, the warning signals, the conversations no one else overheard? And perhaps most chillingly, what role did the other members of the family play, particularly Richard's younger brother, Nathan, who has remained silent for decades until now? Nathan's voice is shaking, laden with grief and anger, as he recounts the truth the world has never heard. And as he speaks, a picture emerges of a family fractured by ambition, envy, and unspoken resentments. It's tempting to think that wealth and fame can shield a family from tragedy. But the Carringtons prove the opposite. Sometimes, the higher the pedestal, the further the fall, and the more devastating the consequences. They lived in a world of luxury, private schools, exotic vacations, and public accolades. Yet underneath it all was a pressure cooker of expectations, secrecy, and suppressed emotions. The very success that made them iconic may have also sown the seeds of their destruction. Consider this. For years, Jason had been portrayed as the troubled son, a young man struggling with identity, independence, and resentment toward his father's towering legacy. Industry insiders hinted at late-night arguments, strange disappearances, and moments when Jason seemed both defiant and desperate. Friends noticed tension that others ignored. Could these glimpses have been warning signs of a storm that no one was prepared to face? Nathan Carrington's revelations add another layer of complexity. As Richard's brother, he had an intimate view of the family dynamic, witnessing both the warmth and the cracks. In a recent, emotional conversation, he revealed that Richard had confided fears he never shared with anyone else. Fears that his own son might one day hurt him. Fears dismissed by outsiders as paranoia, but in hindsight, tragically prescient. Nathan's accounts paint a picture of a man torn between love for his family and terror at the consequences of unresolved conflict. The public's reaction has been a mix of disbelief, horror, and morbid curiosity. How could a household like the Carringtons descend into such tragedy? Social media feeds are saturated with speculation. Some defend Jason, citing mental health struggles. Others condemn him outright, calling the crime unforgivable. Tabloid headlines scream accusations, leaks, and shocking secrets. Every detail, the open gates, the guest house location, the timeline of events, is scrutinized, debated, and analyzed. But the most disturbing revelations are yet to come. What makes this story more compelling than any fictional thriller is that it's real, or at least, it mirrors the very real consequences of family betrayal and hidden tensions. Nathan's testimony threatens to upend what little understanding the public has of the Carringtons. He doesn't just describe the crime scene or the aftermath. He tells of emotional manipulations, unspoken grudges, and a family legacy tainted by unresolved conflict. The Carringtons, once icons of Hollywood elegance, are now symbols of the fragility of human relationships, no matter the wealth, fame, or power involved. But what's even more chilling is the unanswered questions. What truly drove Jason to this point? Was it a sudden eruption of anger, or the culmination of years of simmering resentment? And what other secrets lie hidden in the vast corridors of the Carrington estate? Secrets Nathan is only now beginning to reveal. Each revelation seems to peel back another layer of deception, showing that the public face of the family was only a fraction of the truth. In the coming chapters, you will see the Carrington saga unfold from every angle. The rise of the family, the early signs of tension, the pivotal moments leading to the tragedy, and the emotional fallout that continues to reverberate. You will hear accounts from those who knew them best, see how wealth and power intersect with human frailty, and confront the uncomfortable truth that sometimes, even in the most glamorous lives, darkness can take root unnoticed. So let me ask you directly, how well do you really know the people closest to you? Can love, loyalty, and shared history survive under pressure? And perhaps most importantly, how far can betrayal go before it destroys everything you hold dear? By the end of this story, you won't just understand what happened to the Carringtons. You'll feel the weight of every secret, every argument, every moment of tension that led to that one catastrophic day. The shocking confessions, hidden agendas, and emotional betrayals are waiting. And as Nathan begins to speak, as the pieces start to fall into place, one thing becomes clear. What came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The stage is set. The players are ready. The family's darkest secrets are about to be exposed. And once you know the truth, there is no turning back. From the outside, the Carrington family seemed untouchable. Their lives were a constant parade of red carpet premieres, award-winning films, and society galas. Richard Carrington, a filmmaker whose name was synonymous with cinematic brilliance, had built a reputation as both visionary and perfectionist. He was the man behind blockbusters that critics praised and audiences adored. Marlene, his wife, was equally adored, a socialite whose elegance and charm were legendary. They were the epitome of Hollywood royalty, living in a sprawling Brentwood estate that seemed to float above the rest of the city, shielded by high walls, manicured gardens, and a sense of untouchable glamour. But behind the perfectly staged photos and the curated smiles, the Carringtons' world was more fragile than anyone imagined. Even as they climbed the ladder of fame and fortune, the foundations of their family life were quietly eroding. Small incidents, easily dismissed at the time, hinted at tensions that would eventually explode into tragedy. Jason, the eldest son, was born into privilege, but also into expectation. Richard had been a demanding father from the beginning, insisting on excellence in all things, from schoolwork to music lessons, to the unspoken pressure of continuing the family legacy. Marlene, for all her warmth in public, often sided with Richard's high standards, sometimes unintentionally deepening the pressure on her son. To the outside world, Jason had everything he could want: a massive estate, private schooling, exposure to the elite of Hollywood. But in private, he struggled under the weight of a legacy that felt impossible to live up to. Early friends recall a young man who oscillated between charm and defiance. One moment, he would be laughing effortlessly at a family gathering. The next, he would storm out of the room, slamming doors with a force that startled even adults. Teachers noticed a simmering tension in the classroom, often blaming adolescence, never suspecting that it foreshadowed something far darker. Even his tutors admitted he had brilliance, but there was a storm beneath it. Richard's perfectionism extended beyond work and into his family. He demanded loyalty and often displayed an exacting attention to detail that sometimes crossed into obsession. Family dinners were structured affairs, with conversations carefully navigated to avoid conflict. Yet beneath the polite veneer, power struggles were constant. Jason learned early that rebellion was dangerous, that every step outside the rules would meet with criticism or subtle punishment. Marlene, meanwhile, seemed to live in a dual reality. In public, she was charming, patient, and elegant, often described as the glue holding the family together. But privately, she wrestled with her own frustrations. Nathan, Richard's younger brother, would later describe moments where Marlene's eyes would glimmer with silent exasperation, a kind of silent rebellion against the tyranny of perfection. She loved her son fiercely, Nathan would say, but she also saw him trapped in a world he didn't choose. By the time Jason reached his teenage years, the cracks became more visible. He would vanish for hours, refusing to explain where he had been. Arguments escalated in tone and frequency. Friends noted a growing distance between father and son, a gulf widening that seemed to no one else like it could ever be crossed. And yet, the Carringtons continued to project an image of unity and strength. To their neighbors and the public, nothing was amiss. Behind closed doors, though, tensions simmered like a dormant volcano. Jason's frustration with expectations collided with Richard's insistence on discipline. One incident, later recounted by a former family employee, stood out. Jason had returned late from a private gathering, exhausted and irritable. Richard confronted him, words raised, voices echoing through the halls. Marlene attempted to mediate, but the confrontation ended with Jason slamming his bedroom door, leaving a silence that felt heavy, suffocating. It was a minor incident on the surface, but the echoes of that argument would resurface in ways no one could have imagined. The estate itself, designed to be a sanctuary, became a stage for these tensions. Richard's private office was a space of intense scrutiny, walls lined with accolades and scripts, where the weight of expectation was palpable. Marlene's rooms, filled with art and memories, contrasted sharply with the strict routines enforced elsewhere in the house. Jason's guest house, though luxurious, was a place of both refuge and isolation, where he could retreat yet also feel the immense distance from his parents. Nathan Carrington, ever observant, witnessed much of this. As a younger brother, he had a unique perspective, close enough to notice the undercurrents, yet distant enough to escape the daily tension. He recalled late-night conversations with Richard, where his brother's fears, ambitions, and frustrations spilled out in unguarded moments. Richard loved Jason, Nathan said, but there was a fear he could never express openly. Fear that the boy might break under the pressure, or worse, that he might lash out. The world of the Carringtons was a paradox, dazzling on the surface, fragile beneath. Social engagements, film premieres, charity galas. These were the masks that hid the deeper truths. Every photo, every smile, every handshake was meticulously crafted. But behind the curtain, the family navigated a web of expectations, resentments, and unspoken grievances. One of the most telling signs came during a summer vacation in Malibu. Jason, then 17, had an argument with Richard over trivialities, the kind of argument that would seem minor to outsiders but was catastrophic in the context of their household. Words were exchanged, harsh and cutting, leaving scars that were invisible to the public eye. Marlene tried to smooth things over, but the tension lingered long after the vacation ended. Nathan would later describe this as a turning point, a moment when the balance of power in the family began to subtly shift. Friends and insiders noted that Jason had begun cultivating a sense of independence that unnerved his father. He spent long hours away from the estate, often exploring the city, making connections with peers his parents didn't approve of, and experimenting with ways to assert control over his own life. Richard saw this as rebellion. Marlene, torn between understanding her son and maintaining family order, often mediated behind closed doors. But the cracks were becoming increasingly difficult to hide. By the time Jason reached adulthood, the Carringtons' family dynamics had solidified into a pattern of tension, conflict, and unresolved anger. Every attempt to bridge the gap seemed to backfire. Every disagreement left emotional scars that, while invisible to outsiders, were deeply etched into the family psyche. And yet, for the world outside Brentwood, the Carringtons remained a symbol of success, elegance, and unity. The duality of their lives, public perfection versus private turmoil, would ultimately define the trajectory of events leading to that fateful Sunday. As Nathan's later revelations would confirm, the warning signs were there all along. Small cracks, subtle gestures, late-night arguments, and unspoken resentments created an environment where tragedy was not just possible, but perhaps inevitable. And so, the stage was set. The Carrington family, once untouchable, was living on a knife's edge, balancing wealth, fame, and fragile relationships. Every choice, every conversation, every withheld word added fuel to a fire that no one knew how to control. But what no one could have predicted was how quickly the simmering tension would erupt, shattering the illusion of perfection and leaving behind a trail of questions that would haunt the family and the world forever. The cracks were no longer subtle. The storm was gathering. And in the next chapter, you will see how a single decision, a moment of rebellion, and a hidden grudge set the wheels of tragedy in motion. What came next would push the Carringtons to the brink, and no one saw it coming. Jason Carrington's teenage years were a turning point, the period when charm and rebellion collided, setting the stage for the tragedy that would later unfold. On the surface, he appeared like any privileged teen. Fashionable clothes, late-night outings, and a certain swagger that came from growing up in Hollywood's shadow. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing, fueled by expectations, resentment, and a longing for independence. Friends from Jason's private school remember him as charismatic, intelligent, and unpredictable. One day, he would charm teachers with wit and insight. The next, he would explode over the smallest slight. The volatility was unnerving. He could be the life of the party or the most infuriating person in the room, said a former classmate. It was impossible to know which side you were going to see that day. Richard's influence was omnipresent. The legendary filmmaker demanded excellence not just in career, but in character. Jason's grades, extracurricular activities, and even friendships were scrutinized. Every misstep became a lesson, or, depending on perspective, a reprimand. Marlene, though often the softer presence, struggled to mediate, frequently caught between her husband's exacting standards and her son's growing frustration. One of the first signs of deeper tension occurred during a summer break, when Jason was 16. He had organized a small gathering at a friend's beach house. It seemed innocent, a chance for a teenager to unwind, but Richard had forbidden it, citing poor judgment and association with the wrong crowd. Jason defied the command. The confrontation that followed at the Brentwood estate was explosive. Richard's voice, usually calm and authoritative, rose in anger. Marlene tried to intervene, but Jason's defiance was absolute. He accused his father of being controlling, of failing to understand him, and of prioritizing perfection over love. The argument ended with Jason storming out of the house, slamming doors, and leaving the family in stunned silence. Nathan, witnessing from a discreet distance, would later describe the moment as pivotal. That night, something in Jason shifted. He realized he could push back, and Richard realized he couldn't control everything anymore. This was only the beginning. In the following months, Jason's behavior escalated in subtle but significant ways. He would vanish for hours, sometimes days, refusing to explain where he had been. Private investigators, hired discreetly by Richard, later noted that Jason had begun frequenting off-limits areas of Los Angeles, clubs, underground gatherings, and private events without parental oversight. Though there was no overt criminal activity, the pattern of rebellion was concerning, a warning sign that authority was losing its grip. School administrators also noticed changes. Teachers reported that Jason was increasingly argumentative, refusing to follow instructions, and occasionally aggressive with peers. Counselors were called in, and while Jason's intelligence and charm often deflected criticism, the underlying volatility remained. The Carrington estate, meanwhile, became a microcosm of tension. Every room, every hallway, every interaction was charged with the weight of expectation. A particularly revealing incident occurred during Jason's senior year. Richard had organized a private screening of his latest film, inviting industry veterans, critics, and influential producers. Jason was expected to attend, sit quietly, and maintain the family's polished image. Instead, he arrived late, visibly agitated, and made a pointed remark during the Q&A session that embarrassed his father in front of the assembled audience. The humiliation was palpable, and Richard reportedly retreated to his office, shaken. Marlene tried to smooth the situation over, but Jason's defiance was unmistakable. Nathan later called it the first time Jason openly challenged the public authority of his father. It was small, but symbolic. And symbolism in that house was everything. What's critical to understand is that Jason's rebellion was not merely teenage angst. It was layered, complex, and fueled by a mixture of resentment, fear, and the struggle for identity. Living in the shadow of a legendary father creates pressures most people cannot comprehend. Every mistake is magnified, every failure becomes part of a legacy narrative, and every act of independence is viewed as defiance. Jason's anger, his restlessness, and his secretive behavior were all manifestations of a deeper psychological tension that would only grow over time. Meanwhile, Marlene, ever perceptive, began keeping a private diary, documenting incidents that troubled her. From missing friends' gatherings to unexplained disappearances, she cataloged moments that she feared would escalate. Nathan recalls seeing these diaries, hidden in a drawer behind a painting in Marlene's study. She was trying to make sense of it, Nathan said. She knew something was wrong, but didn't know what to do. Friends also noted subtle warning signs. Jason's fascination with knives, his late-night internet searches, and his growing isolation from peers. None of these indicators, on their own, would raise alarm bells, but together they formed a pattern, a mosaic of risk that, in hindsight, was unmistakable. Looking back, it's chilling, said one former friend. We all thought he was just a rebellious teen. We had no idea how serious it was. The dynamics between father and son were compounded by the shadow of celebrity. In public, Richard maintained his composure, appearing the doting father, supportive and proud. Behind closed doors, however, tension simmered. Nathan describes late-night arguments, often heated but hushed, as if the walls themselves could overhear. The Carrington estate, meant to be a sanctuary, was instead a pressure cooker of unspoken rules, escalating resentment, and unresolved grievances. In addition to family tension, there were the external pressures of Hollywood itself. Jason was constantly reminded of his father's influence, the industry's expectations, and the legacy he was supposed to uphold. Friends report that he oscillated between longing for independence and feeling trapped, leading to moments of self-sabotage and lashing out. The combination of fame, family pressure, and personal turmoil created a perfect storm, one that no one fully understood at the time. Even Nathan, who had always been a close observer, admits that he underestimated the intensity of the emotional undercurrents. You could see it building, he said, but you never imagined it would reach the point it did. Not even close. He describes a moment when Jason, furious over a perceived slight, smashed a door in the guest house. Marlene and Richard were terrified, and Nathan realized then that this was no ordinary teenage rebellion. Something deeper, more volatile, was unfolding. By the time Jason turned 18, the pattern was clear: defiance, secrecy, and unpredictable outbursts. Each incident, minor or major, contributed to an emotional landscape fraught with tension and distrust. Richard's authority had been challenged repeatedly, Marlene's patience stretched thin, and Jason had begun to test the limits of control in ways that would later prove catastrophic. And yet, outsiders, neighbors, friends, industry colleagues, continued to see only the polished exterior. The Carringtons hosted lavish parties, attended premieres, and appeared the perfect family. Social media profiles showed smiling faces, coordinated outfits, and seemingly idyllic gatherings. The public perception of unity and perfection remained intact, masking a simmering internal chaos. So, what does this teach us about family, power, and hidden tension? The Carrington story is a stark reminder that appearances can deceive. A family can appear flawless while danger brews in silence. And sometimes, the warning signs are there, but no one is prepared or willing to see them. But just when it seemed the storm might pass, an event occurred that would shift the trajectory irreversibly. A confrontation, a decision, and a secret would collide in a way that none of them could have anticipated. Jason's rebellion, once a series of isolated incidents, was about to converge with hidden family resentments, setting the stage for tragedy. And what happened next would mark the moment when the Carringtons' carefully constructed world began to crumble, and the shadow of what was to come stretched longer than anyone could imagine. By the time Jason Carrington reached his late teens, the tension within the Brentwood estate had evolved from subtle undercurrents to a palpable storm. Each day seemed to bring new conflicts. Each conversation carried an unspoken weight, and each interaction threatened to ignite long-simmering resentment. For Nathan Carrington, Richard's younger brother, it was a period of observation, anxiety, and growing dread. He could see the patterns forming, but like many who witnessed the first sparks of a fire, he had little idea how quickly it would engulf everything. The household, which had once functioned as a structured sanctuary of wealth and comfort, now operated under stress that seemed to grow exponentially. Richard's perfectionism, once a driving force for success, had begun to border on obsession. He scrutinized every detail, from Jason's schoolwork to the seemingly innocuous interactions with friends. Marlene, though loving and protective, found herself caught between her husband's ironclad expectations and her son's defiance. The resulting tension created a space where even small disputes escalated into major confrontations. One particularly revealing incident occurred on a seemingly ordinary Thursday. Jason had returned from an afternoon outing, visibly agitated and distracted. Richard, noticing a lapse in behavior, confronted him in the grand living room, his voice carrying authority but tinged with frustration. Jason, unwilling to submit, shot back with a sharp, sarcastic retort. Marlene tried to mediate, urging calm and understanding, but the exchange quickly devolved into shouting. The argument lasted for nearly an hour, with walls echoing the sound of slammed doors and footsteps. Nathan, sitting quietly in the adjoining study, could feel the tension radiating through the house. He later described the moment as a warning, clear as day, that something was brewing that none of us could fully comprehend. This pattern repeated with alarming frequency. Jason's outbursts became more intense, his moods more unpredictable. Friends recalled seeing him leave social gatherings in a fury over trivial matters, while family employees reported episodes of quiet, brooding anger followed by sudden confrontations with his parents. The guest house where Jason lived, intended as a space for independence, increasingly became a fortress of isolation, a place where he could vent, plan, or retreat into silence. Marlene, ever vigilant, began documenting incidents in private. Her diary entries, later recounted by Nathan, reveal a mother trying to make sense of escalating tensions. She noted patterns of aggression, secrecy, and rebellion, often juxtaposed with moments of charm and vulnerability that made it difficult to predict what Jason would do next. Nathan, reading portions of the diary years later, reflected on how prescient some of her observations were. She knew, in her heart, that something was off, he said. But no one could have anticipated the scale of what was coming. The broader social environment also played a role. Hollywood, with its constant scrutiny and implicit pressures, magnified every misstep. Jason was acutely aware of his father's legacy and the expectations that came with it. While some teenagers might rebel quietly, Jason's defiance was public, theatrical, and deeply emotional. Friends and acquaintances noted that he often oscillated between charm and volatility, creating an unpredictable presence that both fascinated and unnerved those around him. One of the most critical incidents occurred during a family gathering meant to celebrate Richard's latest award. Jason arrived late, disheveled, and visibly upset. He confronted his father in front of guests, criticizing his methods, dismissing his authority, and openly challenging his decisions. The room fell silent. Marlene attempted to defuse the situation, but Jason's anger was evident and uncontainable. Nathan, observing from a corner, realized that this moment marked a tipping point. The public humiliation of Richard, combined with Jason's unrestrained rebellion, had irreversibly altered the dynamics of the household. Nathan also began noticing subtler signs of psychological strain. Jason's fascination with sharp objects, while previously dismissed as a hobby or interest, now seemed more ominous. Friends reported that he had begun collecting knives, practicing techniques late at night, and exhibiting a heightened sense of secrecy regarding his activities. While there was no overt threat at this stage, the accumulation of these behaviors painted a portrait of a young man grappling with anger, isolation, and the desire for control. The Carrington estate itself, with its grand architecture, sprawling gardens, and luxurious amenities, now felt like a pressure cooker. Every corridor, room, and hidden corner became a stage for tension. Arguments echoed through hallways. Doors slammed with force. Private spaces became battlegrounds for control, rebellion, and emotional release. Nathan, despite his attempts to mediate and observe, could not prevent the escalation. He described the atmosphere as charged, electric, and unpredictable, like a storm ready to break at any moment. Friends outside the family began noticing changes as well. Jason, once approachable and sociable, had grown distant. Invitations were declined or ignored. Social media posts reflected mood swings and veiled frustrations. Those who attempted to reach out often met silence or hostility. It was as if he were constructing a separate reality, one where he could exert influence and control, free from parental oversight. Within the household, the psychological tension was mirrored in subtle yet disturbing ways. Richard became increasingly rigid, enforcing rules with a severity that bordered on obsession. Marlene oscillated between concern and exhaustion, trying to protect her son while managing the mounting conflicts. Nathan, observing the unraveling dynamics, recognized that the family was trapped in a cycle of escalation. Every argument led to retaliation, every reprimand to rebellion, every act of defiance to heightened scrutiny. The danger was compounded by secrecy. Jason's private activities, combined with the family's reluctance to seek external intervention, created a situation in which internal dynamics intensified unchecked. Friends, neighbors, and industry insiders had little insight into the underlying tensions. To outsiders, the Carringtons remained the perfect family, the pinnacle of success and elegance. But within the walls of the estate, the storm was gathering momentum, and no one was immune. One particularly harrowing incident involved a confrontation over the guest house itself. Jason, asserting independence, refused to follow household rules. Richard insisted on oversight, citing safety and respect, while Marlene attempted to mediate. The argument escalated over several hours, with Jason threatening to leave the property permanently. Nathan recalls feeling a sense of foreboding, a chilling realization that the conflict was no longer controllable by reason or mediation. "It was the first time I truly feared for what might happen if these patterns continued," he later said. And yet, despite these warning signs, there were moments of tenderness, moments that made the family dynamic even more complex. Jason could be charming, articulate, and affectionate. Richard, for all his rigidity, could express warmth and pride. Marlene's love for her son was unwavering. These moments, however fleeting, created confusion, false hope, and a sense of contradiction. A duality that made the tension harder to address. As Nathan would later explain, this combination of rebellion, secrecy, and occasional affection created a psychological pressure cooker. Jason's frustrations were amplified by perceived slights, both real and imagined. Richard's authority, undermined in public and private moments, created a sense of frustration and humiliation. Marlene's protective instincts, while genuine, sometimes inadvertently reinforced Jason's sense of entitlement or resentment. The result was a complex web of emotions that none of the family members could fully navigate. And so, the stage was set for escalation. The Carrington estate, once a symbol of success and perfection, had become a crucible for conflict. Jason's rebellion, initially manageable, was now intensifying in ways that foreshadowed a future tragedy. Nathan, ever observant, recognized that the patterns were accelerating, that the consequences could be catastrophic. But just when it seemed that the storm might continue to rage without incident, an event occurred that changed everything. A confrontation, an impulsive decision, and a hidden resentment collided in a single, explosive moment, one that would forever alter the trajectory of the Carrington family. What happened next would set the stage for the most shocking, devastating events in the family's history, and the world would soon bear witness to a truth no one could have imagined. By the time Jason Carrington reached his early 20s, the simmering tension that had characterized his teenage years was no longer subtle. The rebellion that once seemed like typical adolescent defiance had evolved into something far more dangerous. A combination of calculated risk, anger, and a desire to assert control over a life he felt had been dictated for him. The Brentwood estate, once a sanctuary, had become a battleground where every interaction carried the potential for conflict, and every silence felt loaded with unspoken threats. The first major act of defiance that would forever alter the Carrington family dynamic occurred during a seemingly innocuous weekend gathering. Richard had planned a private dinner for friends, colleagues, and industry insiders, a formal event intended to showcase the family's unity and sophistication. Jason, however, had been increasingly resistant to attending family functions, seeing them as orchestrated performances rather than opportunities for connection. Nathan remembers the evening vividly. Jason arrived late, his appearance deliberate, projecting confidence and subtle disdain. Richard greeted him, attempting warmth, but Jason's responses were curt, dismissive. The atmosphere, already tense, became electric the moment Jason sat at the head of the table, subtly positioning himself as an equal to his father rather than a son. The dinner conversation started politely, but quickly escalated. A comment from a friend praising Richard's recent film triggered Jason's sarcasm. "Sure, it's great. If you ignore the fact that real people are tired of the same stories," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Richard's patience, long strained, snapped. He leaned forward, fingers gripping the table, eyes locked on his son. "That's enough, Jason. Respect the people in this room," he said, his tone a mix of anger and authority. Jason's response was chillingly calm. "Respect isn't earned by intimidation," he shot back. The room fell silent. Guests exchanged nervous glances, unsure how to react. Marlene's face paled. Nathan, watching from across the room, felt a pang of fear that this confrontation was far beyond the usual teenage rebellion or even a young adult's defiance. Something deeper, more volatile, had emerged. After the dinner, the argument continued in private. Jason retreated to the guest house, while Richard and Marlene attempted to debrief and process what had occurred. Nathan, sensing the gravity of the situation, tried to intervene. He spoke with Jason, attempting to reason, to understand what was driving this behavior. Jason's answers were vague, deflective, and laced with a growing bitterness. "You don't get it," he said, eyes dark with emotion. "I can't live like this anymore." It was the first time Nathan truly grasped the potential for harm. Jason's words were not mere expressions of frustration. They were threats cloaked in ambiguity, a warning sign that the young man's anger was intensifying and becoming more focused. Nathan recalled thinking, if this continues unchecked, it could spiral into something catastrophic. In the weeks that followed, Jason's behavior escalated. He began isolating himself more intentionally, spending long hours alone in the guest house, often engaged in secretive activities that worried friends and employees. He carried a subtle but unmistakable sense of planning, of control. Observers noted that his fascination with knives and other sharp objects, previously dismissed as hobbies, became more pronounced and methodical. Small but alarming incidents, misplaced objects, locked doors, sudden outbursts, created a sense that Jason was not just rebelling. He was preparing, testing boundaries, and asserting dominance over his environment. Marlene, increasingly concerned, attempted intervention through both empathy and discipline. She scheduled meetings with counselors, tried to establish routines, and encouraged Jason to participate in family activities. Each effort was met with resistance. Jason's responses ranged from silence to mockery to outright aggression. Nathan, witnessing these interactions, began documenting events mentally, aware that the trajectory was accelerating and that intervention might be necessary. One particularly striking incident occurred late one night. Nathan was walking past the guest house when he heard raised voices. He paused, straining to listen. Inside, Jason was arguing with an unseen figure on the phone, his tone sharp, threatening. The words were muffled, but the intensity was unmistakable. When Nathan knocked on the door, Jason's response was icy, almost dismissive. "I don't need anyone's help. Stay out of my business." The encounter left Nathan shaken. It was clear that Jason was no longer a child testing limits. He was a young adult fully aware of his power and willing to wield it. Meanwhile, Richard and Marlene were grappling with a mix of confusion, fear, and guilt. Richard, accustomed to control and authority, was both frustrated and alarmed that his attempts at discipline had failed. Marlene, protective and loving, oscillated between worry for her son's mental state and anger at the disrespect and defiance. The family dynamic had become a cycle of confrontation and attempted reconciliation, each iteration leaving emotional scars deeper than the last. Social circles outside the family also noticed changes. Friends reported that Jason had begun withdrawing from relationships, avoiding social gatherings, and exhibiting signs of obsession with control and power. While some dismissed this as typical behavior for a young adult under pressure, those closest to him, Nathan included, saw the patterns forming, a mosaic of tension and potential danger. It was during this period that Nathan began to keep a closer, more vigilant eye on the household. He observed patterns, noted escalations, and started connecting the dots that others overlooked. "I realized we were walking on a knife's edge," he later admitted. Every confrontation, every act of defiance, was like a warning bell, and yet, we didn't know how close the storm really was. The culmination of this chapter of tension occurred on a fateful night, when Jason's defiance reached its apex. What began as a minor dispute over household rules quickly escalated into a prolonged standoff. Doors were slammed, words were shouted, and emotions ran raw. Nathan watched helplessly as Richard's authority clashed with Jason's determination to assert independence. Marlene attempted mediation, but the emotional charge was too high, too volatile. For the first time, Nathan feared that physical harm, not just emotional damage, was a real possibility. By the end of the night, the household was in disarray. Jason had retreated once more to the guest house. Richard and Marlene were exhausted and emotionally drained, and Nathan was left with an overwhelming sense of dread. He realized, with a clarity that was both terrifying and unavoidable, that the trajectory of the Carrington family had shifted. The patterns of conflict, defiance, and resentment were no longer manageable. They were approaching a breaking point. And as Nathan later recounted, it was during this period that he first sensed the darkness that would culminate in tragedy. He could see the outlines of a storm forming, a convergence of emotion, resentment, and opportunity that none of them fully understood. The warning signs were unmistakable: escalation, obsession, isolation, and simmering rage. But no one knew just how close they were to the edge. What happened next would be the first irreversible step toward disaster, a moment that would forever change the Carrington family and set the stage for the shocking events that followed. The Carrington estate had never felt so tense. Every room seemed to hum with anticipation, every hallway echoing the silent thread of conflict waiting to erupt. By this point, the simmering tension between Jason and his parents had escalated into something that Nathan would later describe as an undercurrent of danger. The patterns of rebellion, defiance, and secrecy were no longer contained. They had started to permeate every corner of the home. It began on a rainy evening in late autumn, a day that seemed ordinary but would become emblematic of the family's unraveling. Richard had returned from a business meeting with colleagues in Los Angeles, expecting a quiet evening to relax and prepare for a film review scheduled the next morning. Marlene had spent the day finalizing plans for a charity gala, coordinating with assistants and volunteers. Jason, as usual, had retreated to the guest house, ostensibly working on personal projects, though his increasing secrecy made it impossible for anyone to know for sure. The first confrontation erupted over something seemingly trivial: the household schedule. Richard insisted on a structured routine for dinner and evening activities, emphasizing that the family needed to maintain order. Jason, already frustrated by the rigidity, refused to comply. The disagreement started as a verbal exchange but quickly escalated. Nathan, who had been observing from the living room, described the scene later. It was like watching two storms collide. Richard's authority was solid, but Jason's defiance was palpable. Neither side was willing to yield, and the tension in the air was suffocating. Jason's voice was sharp, laced with sarcasm and barely contained anger. "I'm not a child. I don't need to follow your rules anymore," he snapped. Richard, attempting to assert control without causing further escalation, responded with measured authority. "Jason, respect the household. Respect your mother. Respect me. This isn't negotiation." The verbal sparring quickly became a power struggle. Jason, emboldened by years of subtle defiance, began testing boundaries more aggressively. He ignored instructions, refused to enter shared spaces, and even threatened to leave the estate altogether. Each act of rebellion was a calculated assertion of independence, but it also chipped away at the fragile equilibrium of the household. Marlene attempted to mediate, her voice a mixture of calm and urgency. She reminded Jason of family values, past sacrifices, and the responsibilities that came with privilege. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Jason might relent. But then, with a defiant glare, he turned and left the room, slamming the door of the guest house with force that shook the walls. The echo reverberated through the estate, a physical manifestation of the emotional storm brewing within. Nathan, already aware of the patterns, recognized this as more than ordinary rebellion. The level of anger, the intent behind it, the precision, it was a warning. I could feel it in my bones. Something had shifted, he recounted. For the first time, the threat was not just emotional or psychological. It carried the weight of potential physical confrontation. Over the following days, the household became a tense chessboard. Jason's movements were deliberate, almost strategic. He would isolate himself, leaving messages that were vague but charged with emotion. He would engage in activities that, while seemingly innocent, demonstrated an increasing obsession with control and preparedness. Sharp objects, previously a benign interest, were now handled with a meticulousness that unsettled even Nathan, who had long been observant of family dynamics. Richard, meanwhile, struggled to maintain authority. His attempts at discipline were met with resistance, and his frustration often manifested in uncharacteristic outbursts. Marlene's protective instincts were constantly tested, her attempts to intervene sometimes backfiring as they intensified Jason's sense of defiance. The pattern of conflict, mediation, temporary calm, and renewed confrontation created a cyclical tension that threatened to spiral out of control. Friends and acquaintances began noticing subtle signs. Jason's social interactions were increasingly marked by aggression or withdrawal. He would make veiled threats, express dissatisfaction with parental oversight, and isolate himself from relationships that might provide perspective or intervention. Observers noted that he seemed to oscillate between charm and volatility, creating an unpredictable presence that left friends wary and concerned. Nathan's role as observer and intermediary became more critical. He attempted to establish boundaries, offer counsel, and intervene where possible. But even his presence could not prevent the growing storm. "I was constantly calculating," Nathan admitted. Every interaction, every word, every pause could trigger an escalation. I felt like a man trying to prevent a wildfire with a garden hose. The first direct confrontation that foreshadowed tragedy came one evening during a family meeting. Richard had called Jason to discuss upcoming estate plans, expecting cooperation and civility. Jason arrived reluctantly, his demeanor tense and guarded. The discussion quickly turned hostile. Words were exchanged, accusations, defenses, and unspoken resentments poured into the conversation like a torrent. Jason challenged Richard's authority in front of Marlene and Nathan, questioning decisions, criticizing past actions, and expressing pent-up frustrations that had been simmering for years. Richard attempted to maintain composure, but the exchange escalated. Jason's tone grew sharper, his body language increasingly confrontational. Marlene pleaded for calm, but the volatility was evident. Nathan watched helplessly as the confrontation reached a point where reason seemed to fail. The emotional intensity in the room was suffocating, and for the first time, Nathan feared that the situation might lead to physical violence. This confrontation marked a turning point. It was no longer just verbal sparring or typical family rebellion. Jason's actions, intent, and demeanor indicated a shift toward potential physical aggression. Nathan's fear was not abstract. It was visceral, a recognition that the patterns he had observed for years were converging toward a dangerous precipice. In the days that followed, Jason's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would isolate himself for hours, sometimes days, disappearing into the guest house and leaving family members anxious and uncertain. He handled sharp objects with an intensity that was difficult to ignore. He sent cryptic messages, posted ambiguous statements online, and displayed signs of obsessive focus. The combination of defiance, secrecy, and volatility created an environment where every moment was a potential flashpoint. Richard and Marlene's attempts at intervention began to strain under the weight of reality. Their authority, once unchallenged, was now openly defied. Their attempts at mediation often escalated tension. Marlene, despite her protective instincts, could not fully manage the growing psychological strain. Nathan, observing and documenting, realized that the family was now teetering on the edge of a catastrophe. The first direct confrontation had revealed the underlying danger, but it was only the beginning. The patterns of defiance, obsession, and escalation were accelerating. Each day brought new challenges, new warning signs, and new moments of tension that hinted at the coming disaster. The Carrington household, once a sanctuary of wealth and privilege, had become a crucible for conflict, a pressure cooker where the smallest spark could ignite an uncontrollable blaze. And then, in a moment of subtle but chilling foreshadowing, Jason made a decision that would forever alter the trajectory of the family. It was an act that seemed minor on the surface, but carried immense emotional and psychological weight. Nathan witnessed it and immediately sensed its significance. The implications were terrifying. The conflict that had been simmering for years was moving from the realm of words to the realm of irreversible action. What happened next would mark the point of no return. The Carringtons, trapped in a cycle of defiance, authority, and secrecy, were about to face a confrontation that would shatter the illusion of safety and perfection they had carefully maintained. The storm that Nathan had feared for so long was no longer theoretical. It was here, and it was about to hit with full force. The tension in the Carrington estate had been building for years, a storm gathering quietly beneath a facade of perfection. By now, the family had entered a dangerous equilibrium. Jason's defiance, Richard's strict authority, Marlene's protective oscillation, and Nathan's watchful eye created a fragile ecosystem, one where the smallest spark could ignite a fire no one could control. And then, one evening, that spark arrived. It was a cool, overcast Friday night, with clouds pressing low over the Brentwood estate, casting the sprawling mansion in a dim, almost ominous light. The family had gathered for a private dinner, ostensibly to discuss mundane matters, upcoming charity events, estate maintenance, and holiday plans. Jason, as usual, appeared tense, sitting with a posture that radiated defiance. His jaw was tight, his eyes alert, scanning the room as though anticipating confrontation. Nathan recalls that night as electric with unspoken danger. "You could feel it in the air," he later said. Everything seemed normal, but the tension was thick. It was like watching a storm before the lightning strikes. The dinner began cordially enough, with Richard attempting to steer conversation toward neutral topics. Marlene smiled and encouraged light discussion, hoping to diffuse the mounting tension. But Jason's mood was unreadable. Every word, every glance, every gesture seemed calculated to test boundaries, to provoke a response, and to assert dominance over the household that had long dictated his life. The first verbal confrontation began subtly. Richard questioned Jason about his absence from family events, framing it as concern for involvement and accountability. Jason responded sharply, dismissing the criticism and accusing his father of controlling behavior. The exchange escalated rapidly. Voices rose. Accusations and defenses collided in rapid succession. Marlene attempted to mediate, but the volatility of the situation made it impossible to maintain calm. Nathan, witnessing the confrontation, felt a rising panic. "This wasn't just an argument anymore," he said. "It was a prelude, and I knew it." As the evening progressed, Jason's defiance shifted from verbal to physical. He stood abruptly, knocking over a chair in a gesture of frustration that reverberated through the room. Richard, attempting to reassert control, stepped toward him, only to be met with a glare so intense it silenced even Marlene. Jason's posture and demeanor suggested a readiness that unnerved everyone present. The line between rebellion and aggression had blurred, and Nathan sensed that this was the first irreversible act, the moment when escalation could no longer be contained. Jason retreated to the guest house shortly afterward, leaving Richard and Marlene to process the evening's events. Nathan, aware of the increasing danger, decided to intervene. He approached Jason, attempting calm dialogue, seeking to understand his intentions and defuse the tension. Jason's responses were cryptic, veiled with sarcasm and subtle threats. His eyes held a determination that Nathan had never seen before. "I don't need anyone controlling me anymore," Jason said, his voice low but unwavering. "I'm done following rules that aren't mine." The emotional fallout of this confrontation lingered through the weekend. Richard became withdrawn, a man grappling with frustration, fear, and a sense of helplessness. Marlene oscillated between protective concern and despair, unable to reconcile her love for her son with the growing threat he represented. Nathan, meanwhile, began documenting every detail mentally, aware that the trajectory of events was accelerating towards something catastrophic. The first irreversible act was subtle, a gesture, a word, a shift in behavior. But its significance could not be overstated. Jason's defiance had crossed a threshold. It was no longer possible to contain the pattern of escalation. The household, already strained by years of tension, now operated on a knife's edge. Nathan describes this period as a descent into a psychological pressure cooker where every action could have unforeseen consequences. Friends outside the family also began noticing changes. Jason's social behavior grew increasingly erratic. He withdrew from previously close relationships, spent long hours alone, and exhibited obsessive focus on matters that seemed trivial but carried hidden intensity. The patterns Nathan had observed for years were now accelerating beyond anyone's control. The night of the irreversible act was also the first time Nathan truly feared for the safety of his brother, Richard, and Marlene. He recalls pacing the hallways of the estate, listening to the creak of floorboards and the rustle of curtains, aware that a single misstep could trigger a confrontation that might escalate into violence. Nathan's sense of foreboding was heightened by the knowledge that Jason's fascination with sharp objects and secrecy had grown more pronounced in recent months. In the days following the incident, Jason's behavior became increasingly unpredictable. He would isolate himself, sometimes leaving the estate for hours without explanation. He engaged in cryptic communication with friends and acquaintances, hinting at plans and intentions that were unclear but unnerving. Marlene, desperate to maintain stability, attempted to implement interventions, including counseling and structured routines, but Jason resisted at every turn. The family was trapped in a cycle of confrontation, temporary calm, and renewed escalation. Nathan's observations became more acute. He noticed subtle changes in Jason's demeanor, the way he moved through the house, the intensity of his gaze, and the careful way he handled objects. Nathan later described these behaviors as ominous, deliberate, and calculated. He realized that the first irreversible act had marked a turning point. The trajectory toward tragedy was no longer theoretical, it was imminent. The psychological strain on Richard and Marlene was profound. Richard, accustomed to controlling outcomes and maintaining authority, felt powerless in the face of his son's escalating defiance. Marlene's maternal instincts were overwhelmed by fear and uncertainty as she struggled to protect her family from a threat that was both internal and unpredictable. Nathan, observing this dynamic, recognized that the family was now operating in a state of constant vigilance, unable to relax, unable to predict what might come next. And then came a subtle but chilling incident that foreshadowed the ultimate tragedy. Jason, during a late-night return from an undisclosed outing, left a note that was ambiguous yet heavy with implication. It was a statement of independence, a declaration of defiance, and a warning all at once. Nathan discovered the note and felt a wave of dread unlike anything he had experienced before. The writing was calm, almost meticulous, but the intent behind it was unmistakable. The household was on edge. Sleep became elusive. Conversations were strained. Every gesture and word was scrutinized for hidden meaning. Nathan describes this period as walking through a minefield, knowing that any misstep could trigger an explosion. The first irreversible act had shifted the family from a pattern of tension to a state of high-alert danger. What happened next would escalate the situation further. Jason's actions, combined with the accumulated psychological strain, created a scenario where confrontation was inevitable. The family, despite their wealth, status, and careful planning, was now at the mercy of forces they could not control. The Carrington estate, once a symbol of security and luxury, had become a crucible of fear, resentment, and looming disaster. Nathan's growing awareness of the stakes made him hypervigilant. He documented patterns, predicted potential escalations, and attempted interventions that were only partially effective. Yet, even his efforts could not prevent the trajectory toward catastrophe. Each day brought new warning signs. Each interaction heightened the tension, and each act of defiance moved the family closer to the ultimate breaking point. And as Nathan would later recount, the night of the first irreversible act was only the beginning. The patterns set in motion that evening would ripple through the household, shaping the psychological landscape and setting the stage for events that no one could have predicted. The storm had begun in earnest, and no one could see where it would strike next. As Jason Carrington transitioned fully into adulthood, the tension that had simmered throughout his teenage years evolved into a more intense, deliberate, and concerning pattern. No longer just a rebellious teen testing boundaries, Jason had begun to develop behaviors that reflected both defiance and a growing desire for control.